Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to get into the fascinating science behind something we do all day, every day, without even thinking about it. Just biting down.
I mean, you might think it's pretty simple, right? Your teeth go up, your teeth go down. But the way they actually meet, that's the result of this incredibly complex system. We're talking about your teeth, your muscles, your jaw joints, all working together. And believe me, getting that right is absolutely crucial in modern dentistry.
So, this science is called occlusion. It's basically the study of how your teeth make contact and how your jaw moves around. And it is the very foundation that lets dentists do amazing things like rebuild smiles and restore function. It's all about making sure everything works in perfect harmony.
All right, so let's dive in. We're going to start by looking at the surprising problem that kicked this whole thing off. Then, we'll trace the key breakthroughs that really shaped dentistry. And to wrap it up, we'll take a little peek into what the future of the perfect bite might look like. The whole field of occlusion, it didn't start because dentists were trying to make perfect crowns or veneers. Nope. It all started with one massive challenge back in the 19th century. How on earth do you make a full set of dentures stable?
So yeah, the big problem wasn't just making the dentures look good. The real challenge was creating a functional, stable bite for patients with no teeth. I mean, think about it. Your natural teeth are anchored right into the bone, but dentures, they just sit on the gums. So any little unbalanced force, and boom, they could go tipping over.
Then, this American dentist, a guy named Bonwell, he came up with this brilliantly simple mechanical fix. He called it a three-point contact system. And the idea was pretty clever. When you chew on one side, the denture teeth should touch at 2 points, but at the same time, they should make a third contact on the opposite side. This creates a stable little tripod that keeps the whole thing from rocking around.
Okay, so Bonwell's theory was a fantastic mechanical fix, but the next big breakthrough, well, that came from trying to actually model the jaw's movement. And the inspiration for it came from a really unexpected place. So there was this Swiss dentist, Alfred Gysi, and he had his patients trace their jaws' side-to-side movements. As he watched, he noticed something pretty remarkable. The pattern that the tracing point made it looked just like the pointed arch of a Gothic window. So, naturally, he called it the Gothic arch.
And that discovery led to his famous axis theory. What Gysi did was he took the super complex sliding and rotating of the jaw and simplified it way down to a pure rotation around these fixed axes. And this was a huge deal. Why? Because it meant you could actually build mechanical devices, we call them articulators, to copy a patient's bite completely outside of their mouth.
But, like a lot of brilliant ideas, Gysi's theory had a pretty big limitation. See, to make his model work, he had to pretend the jaw's motion was just a pure rotation. He had to ignore all those complex sliding movements. It was an elegant simplification for sure, but it definitely wasn't the whole story.
And it's that exact limitation, that gap between a neat, tidy model and messy, real life that paved the way for the next great leap forward in understanding how we bite. So this gap between the theory and what was really happening, it sparked the next big question. People started thinking, okay, instead of trying to simplify the jaw's movement into a model, what if we could actually measure its true path in all 3 dimensions? And then, in the mid-20th century, a Swedish professor, Dr. Ulf Passelt, he went and did exactly that. His work basically took occlusion out of the world of pure mechanics and moved it into real physiology, and it totally changed how we understand the way our jaws move.
So what Passelt did was he tracked points on the jaw in 3D. And by doing that, he mapped out the absolute outer limits of every possible movement. He created the very first true 3D map of the jaw's motion. The shape is so iconic, it's known as the Passelt figure, or, and I love this, more affectionately, the Swedish banana.
Okay, so that's a pretty cool history lesson, right? But how does this whole century-long journey, from Bonwell's denture tripod all the way to Passelt's banana, how does that actually affect you when you go for a routine visit to the dentist today?
I mean, we've come an incredibly long way, right? From these simple mechanical models for dentures all the way to precise 3D measurements of how the jaw moves. But the quest to really understand and perfect the bite, it's not over yet.
When you look back, this journey shows such a clear progression in how we think about this stuff. It went from simple observation, way back in the 17th century, to mechanical models designed to solve one specific problem, and then finally to precise physiological measurement. You can see how each step really built on the one before it.
So, what's next on the journey? Well, it looks like we're entering a totally new era. The focus is shifting now. It's moving away from humans carefully measuring and copying nature, and it's moving towards teaching machines how to perfect it.
And that leads us to a really fascinating question for the future, doesn't it? For centuries, we've been trying to just replicate the jaw's movement. So will machines soon learn to actually design the perfect bite for us, right from scratch? With human experts there just to provide that final touch of wisdom. It's pretty clear, the history of the bite is still being written.
So when you think about dental work, you probably picture cutting-edge, super high-tech medicine, right? But what if I told you the core technology behind that fancy treatment was actually figured out more than 60 years ago? Today, we're going to get into the surprising story of the revolution that happened right inside your mouth. Okay, let's really dive into this, because it's a fascinating thought. That precision crown you might have, the one that feels so incredibly modern, is based on a process that came together before the Beatles even released their first album. How is that even possible? Well, to understand it, we first have to see what dentistry was like before this whole revolution. For most of human history, a really bad toothache had pretty much only one answer, and believe me, it was not a pleasant one. Before we had the tech to actually save teeth, the dentist's job was a lot more direct and, frankly, pretty terrifying. The goal was simple. Just stop the agony by any means necessary. I mean, the sheer brutality of the ven is kind of shocking. We're talking about using heated wires or even acid to just burn out the nerve. Some methods even used arsenic. Yep, literal poison to kill it. It was all about ending the pain, a true brute force approach. Now compare that to today, where the entire philosophy is about saving the natural tooth with incredible precision and almost no pain. It's just an unbelievable leap.
This might hurt a little bit.
Please be gentle.
I can't watch.
You have a very bad tooth.
Of course, even way back then, people tried to repair damaged teeth instead of just killing the nerve. But the first real attempt at a dental crown, the ancestor of what we have today, was this clumsy, handcrafted thing that often created a whole new set of problems. You have to picture this. These early band crowns were made by literally wrapping a thin metal ring around the tooth and then soldering a top onto it. Because they were made entirely by hand, they were never a perfect fit. And that created a fatal flaw, a little gap right at the base of the tooth. And that gap became a breeding ground for new cavities and gum disease, which made it totally useless for any kind of major restoration. So how did we get from that clunky, flawed cap to the amazing precision engineering we have today? Well, the answer wasn't a single invention. Instead, it was 3 completely separate breakthroughs that, when they all came together, changed absolutely everything. So the first hurdle they faced was huge. How in the world do you get a piece of metal to perfectly match the incredibly complex and unique shape of a tooth? Trying to do this by hand with the kind of precision you need was just impossible. The solution, amazingly, came from the world of jewelry. Back in 1907, a guy named Taggart adapted this really elegant technique for dentistry. First, you make a perfect replica of the tooth, but out of wax. Then you encase that wax model in plaster. Once the plaster hardens, you heat the whole thing up, which melts the wax and lets it drain right out, leaving a perfectly shaped empty cavity. You pour in molten metal and voila, you have a perfect metal copy of the original wax tooth. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. So, just as one problem was solved, a brand new one popped up. As it turns out, metal shrinks just a tiny little bit as it cools down from a liquid to a solid. So even with a perfect mold, the final crown would always come out slightly too small, which kind of defeats the whole purpose. And the solution they found is what I find so brilliant. It was a complete reversal of thinking. Instead of trying to change the metal, they thought, why not change the mold? Scientists developed a special type of plaster called cristobalite that does something amazing. It expands when you heat it. By calculating the exact amount the metal would shrink, they could make the plaster mold expand by that exact same amount. The shrinking metal and the expanding mold just canceled each other out, resulting in a perfectly sized crown every single time. It's just genius. Okay, so now we have the technology to create a perfectly shaped, perfectly sized crown. Awesome. But there's one final piece of the puzzle. How do you prepare the patient's actual tooth to receive that crown and do it quickly, precisely, and without a lot of pain? The answer is a sound that everyone instantly recognizes, that high-pitched whine of the dentist office. The third breakthrough was the air turbine high-speed drill. This incredible device uses compressed air to spin a tiny burr at incredible speeds, allowing a dentist to reshape super hard tooth enamel with astonishing speed and accuracy. And so, in the 1960s, these three totally independent streams of innovation, a casting technique from jewelry making, a strange new material from science, and a high-speed tool from engineering, finally came together. This was the moment the foundation of modern dentistry was truly born. The impact was just massive. For the first time, dentistry truly shifted from a practice of yanking teeth out to one of restoring them. Dentists could now confidently repair multiple teeth at once, which opened the door to studying and treating the entire bite, the science of occlusion, as one big, complex system. And this 60-year-old process? It's the foundation that all modern crowns, even today's fancy ceramic ones, are still built on. So the revolution of the 1960s is still supporting the health of our mouths even today. It has saved millions, if not billions, of teeth all over the world, which raises a really fascinating question. What are the next 60 years going to bring? A new wave of technology is already here. You got digital scanners replacing those goopy physical molds. 3D printers are creating dental appliances right on the spot. We're seeing advanced new materials, and even AI helping to diagnose problems earlier and more accurately than ever before.
Okay, so we're about to dive into this incredible, almost microscopic world where dentistry meets high-precision engineering. It's a place where a person's bite is treated like the source code for a super complex biological machine. This is the story of gnothology, a truly radical attempt to perfectly rebuild a smile that was completely lost. I mean, really think about that for a second. If all your teeth were gone, the entire instruction manual for how your jaw closes, how it chews, how it functions, it's just erased. The map is gone. So where do you even start? This was the huge problem that a really bold group of dentists decided they were going to solve. All right, let's get into it.
So our story kicks off back in the 1920s. Dentistry was making these huge leaps forward. But with all this new technology came a brand new, really high-stakes problem that the old ways just couldn't handle. Two American dentists, McCollum and Stollard, they looked at these huge reconstructive challenges and thought there has to be a better way. They came up with this whole new philosophy, a truly mechanical, scientific approach for tackling what seemed like an impossible job.
And this right here, this was the core of their whole philosophy. They basically said, look, trying to build a bite based on some mathematical average or some external theory is just fundamentally wrong. To them, it seemed really weird that the blueprint for a part of your own body would exist outside of your body. The real design, they insisted, had to be found inside the patient's own unique skeleton.
So you see, this was a massive shift in thinking. McCollum and Stollard's idea was that the true design isn't an average at all. It's totally unique to each person, and it's physically encoded right there in their jaw joint. They were going to read the blueprint directly from the source.
And of course, they had to give this new quest a name. Gnothology. It literally means the study of the jaw. But for them, this wasn't just some new technique. They saw it as the start of a whole new science, one that was dedicated to cracking the code of jaw movement.
And this slide just lays out the issue perfectly. You see, old school dentures, they just kind of sat on the gums, right? On the soft, forgiving cushion. There was some wiggle room. But the new crowns and bridges? Totally different story. They were rigidly fixed, basically bolted directly to the jawbone. So any tiny little mistake in the bite wasn't cushioned anymore. No, it was like a shockwave sent straight to the jaw joint.
To solve this, the pioneers of gnothology knew that guesswork just wasn't going to cut it. They needed a fixed and unchangeable reference point inside the human body, a true north that they could use to navigate and rebuild the entire system with absolute mechanical certainty.
And they found their true north in this concept called the hinge axis. Just picture a simple door hinge. No matter how you swing that door, it only ever moves around that one fixed point. Well, they believed the jaw had a similar axis, and that every single complex motion it makes was just a combination of pure rotation around this axis and the axis itself moving through space.
And along with that came another key idea, centric relation. Think of this as the jaw's factory default setting. It's that position of perfect rest and stability, defined purely by your bones, totally independent of where your teeth happen to be. This was like the ultimate reset button, a reliable starting point you could always go back to, even when that original blueprint was totally done.
So, the theory? It was beautiful, really elegant. But how do you capture this completely invisible data from a living, breathing person? Well, this is where the story gets really wild and starts to feel like something out of early science fiction, with this whole series of incredible devices designed to make the invisible visible.
Let's start with step 1. To find their true north, they invented this thing, the hinge axis locator. Yeah, it looks like a pretty complex headset, and its entire job was to hunt for a single, unmoving point on the patient's skin, the spot on the outside that corresponded to that internal hinge. And the genius of this thing is its simplicity. Check this out. As the patient made a tiny opening and closing motion, a little needle near their ear would move. If the needle was off axis, it drew a tiny little arc. But when they adjusted it to the perfect spot, the needle stopped arcing and just spun in place. That's it. They'd found the center. And this just shows how certain they were about this point. It was so fundamental, so absolutely crucial, that to make sure it was never lost between appointments, they would actually numb the patient's skin and permanently mark the spot with a tattoo, a tiny, precise dot on each side of the face. Incredible.
Okay, so with those axis points tattooed on, step 2 was all about mapping them. For that, they used the hinge bow, which was basically a surveyor's tool for the human face. It locked onto those tattooed points and created a super precise 3D map, recording exactly where the upper jaw was in relation to that all-important hinge axis. And that brings us to the main event, the pantograph. This wild-looking contraption was attached to the patient, and it was designed to act like a seismograph for the jaw. Its one and only job was to trace every tiny nuance of the jaw's movement onto these little recording plates.
So as the patient moved their jaw forward, left, right, every which way they could, a series of little needles would scratch these intricate lines. And these weren't just random squiggles. They were the patient's unique biomechanical signature, a literal fingerprint of their jaw's motion, captured right there on paper.
So, here's the crucial question. What happens next? You've got tattooed reference points, you've got 3D maps, you've got a whole folder full of these weird line drawings. How on earth does that become a new set of teeth?
Well, this is where the magic really happens. Those lines, they became an instruction manual for a machine. By measuring the angles of those tracings, clinicians could physically set the dials and controls on this thing, the fully adjustable articulator. It was basically a form of analog programming, using physical data to configure a mechanical device.
And this right here, this was the massive breakthrough. They had created a mechanical twin, a perfect metal replica of the patient's entire jaw system that could just sit on a lab bench. For the very first time, technicians could design and test new teeth for perfect harmony without the patient even being in the room. This saved just countless hours of painstaking adjustments.
But, and you knew there was a but coming, right? This beautiful, precise, clockwork theory had a fundamental challenge. As precise as it was, there was always going to be a gap between that mechanical perfection and the complex, kind of messy reality of human biology.
Here was the core problem, right here. See, Glenology's whole mechanical model was built on the idea that the end of the jawbone, the condyle, was a perfect sphere, super simple and predictable to work with mechanically. The problem? Biological reality isn't that simple. A real human jaw joint is much more irregular, kind of like an egg shape. And that one seemingly small difference, well, it turned out to be a fatal flaw in the whole system.
And on top of that, this biological reality started to show the limits of their incredible machines. I mean, for all its amazing precision, the pantograph was ultimately measuring movement on the skin, not on the bone itself. It just couldn't see through the layers of muscle and tissue and everything else in between. And that meant an inherent margin of error was always going to be there. It was unavoidable. And in fact, you can actually see the theory itself had to adapt over time. That core concept of centric relation, it really evolved over the decades. It started as this search for a single, rigid point in the bone, but it slowly softened into a more practical, functional position that was clinically useful, even if it wasn't some perfect theoretical absolute.
See, by physically working with these incredibly sophisticated articulators, by adjusting them, by feeling how they moved, dentists started to build this high-fidelity model of the jaw's mechanics right inside their own heads. The jaw wasn't some mysterious black box anymore, it was something they could actually visualize and simulate in 3 dimensions in their mind's eye. The machine literally installed a mental articulator that was maybe even more valuable than the physical one.
So in the end, gnathology might not have been the perfect copy of reality it set out to be, but its legacy? Wow, it's arguably so much more profound. In its incredibly ambitious attempt to simulate a part of the human body, it didn't just rebuild the bite, it rewired the mind of the dentist. And that leaves us with this really fascinating question. Sometimes is the most valuable output of a simulator not the answer it gives you, but the deep understanding it builds in the person who uses it.
So this all leaves us with one last big question. The pioneers of gnathology pushed analog technology to its absolute breaking point, trying to model the perfect jaw. So now, in our modern age of 3D scanning, of motion tracking, and AI, can we finally crack the code? Can we overcome those biological barriers that stop them in their tracks? Could our digital technology finally achieve that grand analog era dream? It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? You ever stop and think about how your jaw actually moves? I mean, really think about it. For decades, the science seemed pretty settled. But what if the experts were, well, just plain wrong? This is the story of a scientific hunt. A story about a team of researchers who decided to challenge a core idea and ended up discovering the jaw's true center of motion. So, it all kicks off with a really simple question. We open and close our mouths all day long, and it feels kind of like a simple hinge, doesn't it? Well, back in the 1960s, a group of researchers in Tokyo started thinking that the established theory, which pretty much treated it that way, was missing a huge piece of the puzzle. So they decided it was time to put it to the test. And that really set the stage for a classic scientific showdown. You had the old, established theory on one side and a brand new, radical question on the other. Let's see what happens when these two ideas finally collide. So in one corner, you've got the dominant theory coming out of the United States, known as gnathology. It's basically the study of the whole chewing system, and it was built on 2 core ideas, a theoretical hinge axis for movement and a starting point called centric relation. But in the other corner, a new way of thinking was bubbling up in Tokyo. They were proposing a more natural starting point they called the stable condylar position and a revolutionary new idea for the center of movement, the kinematic axis. And listen, this wasn't just some abstract debate happening in a journal, It was driven by a really dedicated team, led by Professor Ishihara at the former Tokyo Medical and Dental University. 2 key researchers, Oshi and his junior colleague Kono, were about to publish work that would challenge decades of accepted science. They were going to rewrite the book on how we chew, talk, and move our jaws. Okay, so before they could even think about finding this true axis of rotation, the Tokyo team had to solve an even more basic problem. Where does the jaw's movement actually begin? What's the real starting point? And this is where Oishi made a huge breakthrough. See, up until then, most of this kind of research was done on specimens preserved in formalin. The problem is, formalin makes tissue rigid and totally unnatural. Oishi realized this was a massive flaw. If you want to see how the jaw truly moves, you need to study it in a state that's as close to life as possible. So he used fresh specimens. And that one decision, it changed everything. By looking at these fresh specimens, Oshishi found something, well, kind of profound. The head of the jawbone, that part we call the condyle, it didn't need to be forced into some special position. It just settled. It found its own comfortable, stable spot in the socket. This was a position of effortless natural function. And he gave it a name, the stable condylar position, or SCP. And this really gets to the core philosophical difference here. Gnathology's centric relation was an artificial position. You had to literally push the jaw back as far as it could go. But Oishi's stable condylar position was a natural, functional resting spot, and it was incredibly precise, with only about 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters of wiggle room. It wasn't some theoretical extreme. It was the jaw's true functional home base. All right, so they've found the jaw's true starting point, but that just opened up an even bigger mystery. What is the actual center of rotation for every single movement the jaw can make?
Professor Ishihara was absolutely driven by this one powerful idea. He just didn't buy that the existing hinge axis, which by the way only worked for one tiny specific opening motion, was the whole story. He had this gut feeling that nature had to be more elegant than that. There had to be a single true axis that governed everything, from a massive yawn to chewing side to side.
Now, to find this thing, you can't just guess, you need data. So they built this incredibly clever custom rig. They used strobe photography to capture movement like a flipbook in tiny slices of time. They made a special splint with 2 little white markers on it for the lower jaw, and then used a Facebook to map the exact location of the condyle. And they did all of this in a pitch-black room to get perfectly clear photos of the jaw in motion.
So getting all those pictures was just the first part. The real heavy lifting was still to come. Now they had to dig through thousands of data points to find a hidden pattern. The hunt was now purely mathematical.
Okay, think about it like this. When a wheel rolls down the street, it's doing 2 things at once, right? It's moving forward, that's translation, and it's spinning, that's rotation. But the axle right in the middle, it only moves forward. It doesn't spin at all. The researchers faced the exact same problem. They needed to find the axle of the jaw, a point on the condyle that only slid without rotating, because by definition, that point would have to be the true center of rotation for everything else.
Their method was just brilliant. So first they tracked those 2 external markers through every jaw movement you can imagine. Then they basically created a virtual grid of over 120 test points all over the condyle. Using the data from the outside markers, they could then calculate the exact path that each one of those 120 points would take. And the last step was the hunt. They compared all of those calculated paths, looking for that one special point whose path wasn't some crazy loop, but just a simple, pure sliding motion.
So after all that painstaking work, the fresh specimens, the custom camera rig, the pages and pages of calculations, the moment of truth finally arrived.
And when they plotted all that data, boom, there it was, right on the graphs. Just like they thought, most of the test points traced out these wild, chaotic, looping paths. But the paths from one very specific region of the condyle, they all collapsed. They all converged into a single, beautiful, elegant curve. This was it. They'd found it.
And get this, the precision was just mind-blowing. This path wasn't some vague area. It was an incredibly narrow band, measuring just 0.7 millimeters wide on average. It didn't matter what the jaw was doing, opening, closing, moving sideways. The true center of rotation always traveled along this incredibly specific track.
And they gave this amazing discovery a name, the kinematic axis. This is that specific point on the condyle that is the true center of rotation for all jaw movements. So unlike a simple hinge that just pivots in one spot, the kinematic axis actually moves. It slides predictably right along that 0.7 millimeter curve, and it governs every single complex motion your jaw makes. So here's the core problem, right? Well, the answer is this amazing concept called the kinematic axis. To get us there, here's our game plan. So here's our setup. We know the coordinates of 2 points. Let's call them point A and point B. Our main goal is to find the coordinates of a third, totally unknown point, point C. And to do that, we have 2 absolutely crucial clues. First, we know the exact distance from B to C. We'll call that R. And second, we know the angle of C in relation to the direction from A to B. We'll call that theta. Believe it or not, that's everything we need.
First, we just calculate the length of the line between A and B. And second, we figure out its precise direction. See? Pretty straightforward. Now, what's really important here is how we define that direction. Instead of just using a single number for slope, we're going to break it down into 2 separate parts, a horizontal piece, u, and a vertical piece, v. This approach, using a vector, gives us a much more powerful and precise way to handle direction, and you'll see just how critical that is in our very next step. So, we've got our baseline direction from A to B, but our target, point C, isn't on that line. This is where the magic happens. We need to perform a rotation. This is where our angle, theta, finally comes into play, letting us pivot our baseline and aim it exactly where we need to go.
Now, I know this might look a little intense, but don't worry about it. These are just the standard formulas for rotation in trigonometry. Think of them like a machine. You feed in your original direction components, u and v, and you pop in the angle, theta. The machine cranks for a second and then spits out a brand new set of direction components that are perfectly rotated for us. So, let's just recap what we did. We took our original direction vector, u, v,
We ran it through those formulas using our angle theta, and that transformed it into a new vector, which we're calling u prime, v prime. And the coolest part? This new vector points directly from B straight towards our final target, C. We now have the correct heading. Conceptually, the idea is incredibly simple. The location of our target, C, is just our starting point, B, plus the distance we need to travel in that new direction we just worked so hard to calculate. That's it. That's the core logic.
Now, let's just translate that simple idea into math. The x-coordinate of C is just the x-coordinate of B, plus our distance r, multiplied by our new horizontal direction, u prime. And we do the exact same thing for the y-coordinate using v prime. It's just simple addition and multiplication.
So, the next logical step is to just plug in the full rotation formula for u prime that we saw a minute ago. See what we're doing? We're just substituting one piece of our puzzle into another, building up towards the complete picture. And finally, we replace the original u and v with what they actually are, the pieces that are based on points A and B. And there it is, the whole shebang, the complete, fully assembled formula. And because we built it together piece by piece, this equation that looked so daunting before now makes perfect sense. We actually did it. And this is where it gets really cool. This is not just some abstract exercise from a math textbook. The exact formula we just built, step by step, is literally found in professional medical textbooks. Doctors and biomechanical engineers use it to analyze the incredibly complex rotational movements of human joints, like your knee or your shoulder. I mean, when you put them side by side, the difference is just, well, it's night and day. The old hinged axis, it only worked for a tiny little opening movement. The kinematic axis applies to all of them. The path of the old axis was sloppy and wide, more than 3 times wider in fact, but the kinematic axis follows that super precise 0.7 millimeter track. One was a temporary guess, the other was the true center of rotation.
This discovery wasn't just some minor correction in a textbook. It gave us a fundamentally new and honestly a much simpler way to understand one of the most complex joints in the entire human body.
What the Tokyo team ultimately gave us was this beautiful, elegant simplicity hidden inside all that complexity. They proved that any jaw movement, no matter how wild it seems, can be broken down into 2 simple things happening at the same time. That kinematic axis point sliding along its defined path, and the rest of the jaw rotating around that moving point. It's a gorgeous, unified theory of motion. This story from over 50 years ago is just such a powerful reminder that science is never really settled. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What other big ideas that we all take for granted today are just waiting for the right person to ask the right question and find a deeper, more elegant truth hiding just beneath the surface? You know, what if you could perfectly copy a person's jaw movement? I mean, every tiny little detail, and put it inside a computer. It sounds like something straight out of science fiction, right? Well, it's not. It's a real technology that is completely changing dentistry as we speak. We're going to dive into this incredible idea called the virtual kinematic axis. So, here's where we're headed. We're going to start by looking at this classic, century-old dental challenge. Then, we'll get into the revolutionary new idea, the virtual kinematic axis. We'll unpack its secret, see how it actually works in a clinic, and then we'll look to the future. A future where AI helps design your teeth.
All right, let's jump into part 1, a century-old dental challenge. For more than 100 years, the field of dentistry has been stuck on this one fundamental problem. How do we actually replicate a patient's unique bite outside of their own mouth?
And here's why it's so hard. Your jaw doesn't just swing open and shut like a door hinge. Oh no, it slides forward. It grinds sideways. It even has this subtle twisting motion. It's this incredibly complicated 3D dance, and it's completely different for every person on the planet. For decades, the best answer anyone had was this thing, the mechanical articulator. And you got to admit, it's a beautiful piece of engineering. Super intricate, very expensive, all metal, but it also required a ton of time and a really, really skilled technician to even get it close. But here's the catch, the big limitation. For all its complexity, a mechanical articulator could only ever approximate the real movement. See, it was fundamentally an indirect guess. It was never, ever a perfect one-to-one copy of what was actually happening in the patient's mouth.
And that limitation, that fundamental problem of just guessing, is what led to a totally new way of thinking. So in part 2, we're going to look at this revolutionary new idea, the virtual kinematic axis. This isn't just an upgrade, it's a total shift in philosophy. So let's start with the big question right up front. What if trying to make a perfect one-to-one copy of reality isn't actually the smartest way to understand it? What if a simpler, more elegant model, a smarter map, could actually get you a better result than a perfect recreation of the territory itself?
Okay, to really get our heads around this, we just need 2 simple ideas from philosophy. And don't worry, it's super easy. First, you've got ontology. That's just the territory, reality as it actually is, the thing itself. And then you have epistemology. That's the map. It's our understanding, our model of that reality. So the territory and the map. That's it.
So where does this big idea actually show up in the real world? Well, believe it or not, it completely revolutionized the field of dentistry. Yeah, I know, but stick with me. Let's start by looking at how they used to do things, the old way.
For years, the ultimate goal in advanced dentistry was this incredibly ambitious quest to perfectly, physically replicate the exact unique movement of a patient's jaw. The idea was to copy the territory, the ontology, with absolute, perfect precision. A monumental task.
And how did they even try to do this? Well, just look at the tools they used. These things called articulators and pantographs. We're talking large, incredibly complex, almost steampunk-looking mechanical devices designed to capture every tiny nuance of the jaw. The sheer complexity of the tools tells you everything you need to know about how hard this was.
You see, the core belief behind all of this was that to make an accurate map, you had to first perfectly replicate the entire territory. They thought ontology and epistemology, the territory and the map, were basically the same thing. You couldn't have one without the other. And that assumption is what made everything so unbelievably complicated.
But then, something completely new came along. A real game changer. A total paradigm shift that was born from deciding to do something radical, to finally separate the map from the territory. And really, the heart of this new way of thinking is captured right here in this one idea. It is better to separate ontology and epistemology. That was the breakthrough. Instead of chasing a perfect copy of reality, the new thinking was, wait a minute, let's just focus on making a better map.
And this simple philosophical shift completely changed the question they were asking. It went from this massive, almost impossible question, how can we perfectly replicate physical reality, to a much smarter, more focused question. Hang on, what information do we actually need to make a crown that just works? And that new question led to a totally new goal. The focus shifted dramatically. Instead of this epic quest to replicate the entire jaw skeleton, the objective became way clearer. Just replicate the functional movement of the teeth. That's it. Turns out that's the only part that really matters.
So how does this brilliant new map, this virtual kinematic axis method, actually work? Let's pop the hood and see the really elegant, simple idea that's powering the whole thing. Okay, it's all based on a beautifully simple geometric principle. Any object in 3D space can be completely defined by just 3 points. Think about it, right? You fix one point, and an object can kind of wobble around it. You fix a second point, and now it can only spin on the axis between those 2 points. But the second you lock in that third point, boom, the object is completely fixed. It can't move at all.
This table just lays it all out. The philosophy shifts from ontology to epistemology, from chasing the territory to perfecting the map. The goal changes from replicating a physical access to replicating a functional movement. And the tools, they go from that complex, heavy machinery to just simple, elegant geometry. That shift in the goal is the biggest deal of all. From trying to be a god and find the true physical reality to the practical mission of just making something that works perfectly.
Okay, we've been deep in the world of dentistry. I get it. But let's zoom out now because the lesson here is huge. Let's talk about why choosing a smarter map over a perfect copy of the territory is such a powerful idea for every single one of us.
So what did we get by giving up on that perfect copy? Well, first, the results actually got more accurate. The whole process became unbelievably simpler and faster. And of course, that meant the costs just plummeted. And the bottom line? Better dental care became accessible to way more people. A huge win.
Okay, so that's the theory. That's the beautiful geometry behind it all. But how does this get used in a real dental clinic, day to day? Let's take a look at the digital workflow and see how we go from a real person to a virtual patient.
Okay, so how do we build this thing? Well, there are two main paths, and the first one is pretty wild. It's the purely digital workflow. And the name says it all. This approach completely skips the physical models. Everything is captured directly from the patient and lives inside the computer from start to finish.
The whole process kicks off with some prep work. First, a cool little device called an intraoral scanner zips around the mouth and creates these super precise 3D models of the teeth. Then, using CAD software, a special splint is designed. You can think of it like a custom-fit mouthguard, but with these little markers on it. That splint gets 3D printed and fitted onto the patient's teeth, and just like that, the stage is set for what comes next.
Now for the fun part, capturing the data. They use a device called the digital facebo, which is basically a GPS for your jaw. It figures out exactly where your jaw is in relation to your head. To connect that GPS data to the 3D teeth models, they just do a quick rescan with that special splint in place. And then, this is where the real magic happens. It's literally Hollywood-style motion capture, but for your mouth. A headset with 3D cameras tracks those little markers on the splint as the patient moves their jaw every which way. Left, right, forward, open. All of it. Okay, we've got all this amazing data. Now it's time to put the puzzle together. The dentist helps the patient find their centric occlusion. That's just a fancy term for your most stable natural bite. This becomes the model's home base. Then, inside the software, the Facebo data snaps the upper jaw model into the right place. And that stable bite data, that locks the lower jaw and perfectly. And voila! You have a complete, dynamic, digital replica of the patient's jaw.
Now, you're probably thinking, wow, that sounds complicated. And you're right, it is. But here's a mind-blowing little tidbit from the source material for this explainer. It suggests that in the near future, AI could automate this entire intricate alignment process with just a single click. Imagine, all that work just done. That's not just faster, it could make this amazing technology available to so many more people.
Okay, so that's the all-digital world. But in an age of screens and data, a lot of experts still swear by a more traditional method. This is the path of skill, and it's all about physical reassurance.
So why go analog? Honestly, this quote just says it all. It's just more reassuring to have a physical model. It really gets to the heart of the craftsman's mindset. It's about the confidence you get from touch, from feeling the object in your hands, a feeling that a screen full of data just can't give you.
And this process is pure, beautiful craftsmanship. It starts by making a super accurate plaster model from a traditional impression. Next, they use a cool tool called a Facebo. You can think of it like a compass for your face to get the upper model positioned perfectly on the articulator. And finally, a little wax record, called a mush bite, is used to lock the lower model in place, creating a perfect match. It's an incredible hands-on assembly.
And this is the huge advantage here. It's all about what the technician can physically feel, the weight of the model in their hands, the texture of the plaster, the ability to trace a tiny curve with their fingertips. You just can't feel a pixel on a screen. This physical feedback gives a sense of confidence that's built on years and years of experience.
So we have Team Digital and Team Physical. It sounds like two opposing camps, right? Well, what if I told you they don't have to be? This is where things get really, really interesting. The two worlds can actually be fused together.
So here's how they build the bridge. You start with the perfectly assembled physical model. Then you stick these tiny little marker balls on it. After that, a 3D scanner captures the entire setup, the articulator, the models, everything. That scan data is then used to create what's called a digital twin, a perfect one-to-one digital copy of all that painstaking physical work. It's the best of both worlds. And this really lays out the difference perfectly. The fully digital path, it starts with the patient and lives completely inside the computer. The hybrid path, though, starts with that physical plaster model, something a technician can actually touch. Both ways work great. It just gives clinics the option to choose the workflow that they're most comfortable with.
So we've got the data, we've built the model, we're done, right? Well, not so fast. Here's the twist. No matter how carefully you record it, raw motion data always has these tiny little errors and glitches in it. It's just noise. And that noise can make the digital model move weirdly or cause the virtual teeth to crash into each other instead of fitting together smoothly. So the raw data isn't good enough. It needs to be perfected.
And that's where AI steps in to be the hero. The solution is AI optimization. Think of it as the ultimate finishing touch, the final polish that takes both methods to a whole new level of perfection. So what's the AI actually doing? Well, it looks at the entire path of your jaw's movement and hunts down those micro errors that no human could ever spot.
Then, it intelligently smooths out all that raw, jittery data, transforming it into a motion that is perfectly fluid and completely natural. It really is like adding a final, almost divine touch of technological perfection.
And what's so amazing is that the virtual kinematic axis solves a problem that has been a headache in dentistry for decades. See, every single person has a slightly different width between their jaw joints. In the physical world, that meant every piece of equipment had to be manually tweaked and adjusted for every single patient. But this software uses a brilliant mathematical trick called coordinate transformation to basically make that problem disappear. It takes any patient's data, no matter their anatomy, and converts it to fit one universal, standard virtual model.
And this leads us to the very core of this whole innovation. And believe it or not, it all comes down to a single number. One number that standardizes everything and makes this all possible.
And that number is 110 millimeters. It doesn't look like much, I know, but in this world, that number is absolutely profound.
Here's why it's a total game changer. By standardizing the width of the virtual articulator to 110 millimeters, the software can just elegantly ignore the patient's specific anatomy. That coordinate transformation we talked about handles it all. This means the dentist doesn't have to worry about the width of the jaw anymore. They can focus purely on what really matters, the actual motion of the teeth. It creates this one-size-fits-all platform that's consistent, universal, and error-free.
And you can even take this digital twin to the next level. For really complex situations, you can overlay the patient's CT or MRI scans right onto the model. When you do that, you get a complete digital replica, not just of the teeth, but of the underlying bones and joints that are actually driving all that movement. It's the whole picture.
And the real-world advantages here are huge. This method captures super complex movements that those old mechanical devices couldn't even dream of. Plus, dentists no longer have to waste time searching for some theoretical center of the jaw joint. They can just focus on the one thing that actually matters, the cold, hard data of how the patient's teeth really, truly move.
Now, this is where this technology really shines. It's for these cases called long-centric and wide-centric. So what does that mean? Well, for many of us, our bite isn't just one single perfect point. It's more of a small area, a little zone where our teeth can comfortably settle and slide around. A good way to think about it is like a gear shift in a car. There's a little bit of play or wiggle room in neutral, right? Well, for decades, those old mechanical articulators just couldn't deal with that. They'd force the bite into one single fake point, and that's why you'd get a new crown and it would feel high, and the dentist would have to sit there and grind it down. It was a nightmare. But now with the virtual kinematic axis, we can map that entire area of movement, that whole wiggle room with absolute precision. We're finally designing for the patient's actual bite, not some made-up ideal point.
Now, as cool as all that is, the most exciting part is what this unlocks for the future. And that brings us to our final section. AI designs your teeth. This is about more than just copying what's there. It's about laying the foundation for artificial intelligence to design what should be there. Welcome to Gnathology 2.0.
I mean, think about it. AI is only as smart as the data you feed it. And what we have here is this incredibly precise, dynamic, personalized data about jaw movement. It's the perfect fuel. It's the 5-star gourmet training data that an AI needs to get really smart about teeth.
And this quote just says it all. Gnathology 2.0 is not about recreating the past with new technology. It's about enabling AI to create the future. We're not just putting a digital screen on an old idea. We are starting a completely new chapter.
So what does this future actually look like? Well, it means AI becomes a co-designer, a true partner for the dentist. It's an AI that understands your individual movements so perfectly that it can intelligently design the ideal shape for your new teeth. A shape that is perfectly functional, looks beautiful, and is truly 100% personalized just for you.
So let's end with that thought. A future where AI understands every nuance of how your jaw moves, and it designs a tooth that is functionally and aesthetically perfect for you and for you alone. That future, it is a lot closer than you might think. The virtual kinematic access is the key that unlocks that door. So the only real question left is, are you ready for it?
All right, let's talk about how our bodies deal with damage. You might think the goal is always perfection, but the real answer is actually way smarter. And we're going to start with a part of you that's working right now, your jaw. Okay, so let's just dive right in. When something in our life breaks, we want it fixed perfectly, back to its original, flawless state. And we kind of assume our bodies are trying to do the same thing after an injury. But what if that's not the point? What if biology's real genius is in a much more practical, much more clever strategy? So, our story really kicks off with the temporomandibular joint. You've probably heard it called the TMJ. It's this super complex hinge that connects your jaw to your skull. And believe me, it does a phenomenal amount of work, day in and day out. Tucked inside that joint, there's a little cushion made of something called fibrocartilage. Think of it like a tiny, powerful shock absorber. But every single time you chew or talk or yawn, that disc is taking a hit. It's literally designed to wear down over time. But don't worry, your body's got a plan. And this is where it gets really cool. Your body is constantly, and I mean constantly, patching up this cartilage. But here's the twist. It isn't trying to make it perfect again. It's not going for a factory reset. Nope. The goal is something way, way smarter. And that brings us to the big idea for today, optimization. See, your body's number one priority isn't to perfectly restore how things used to be. It's all about making sure things will work in the future. It's just about keeping the whole system up and running. To put it simply, optimization just means getting the best possible result with what you've got to work with. I mean, think about it. Your body has a limited energy budget, a limited supply of raw materials, and it's always short on time. So the goal isn't to build some museum-quality jaw joint. It's to keep you chewing and talking without missing a beat. This analogy is just perfect. Imagine your body is a road crew on the super busy highway. A pothole shows up. What do? Do they shut down all the lanes for weeks to find the absolute perfect shade of asphalt? Of course not. They get out there, they patch the hole as fast as they can, and they keep the traffic moving, because function always comes first. And this is exactly how that biological road crew works. It's all about speed and efficiency, not perfection. First, your immune cells rush in and they clear out all the debris, the damaged tissue. Then, new collagen gets laid down like a quick patch. And finally, the body actually remodels that patch to make it better at handling stress. It's a fast, good enough strategy to keep your jaw working so you can get on with your life. Okay, now let's zoom out for a second. Because this brilliant, good enough strategy, it isn't just for fixing your jaw. It's a fundamental principle for how all of life gets built and, more importantly, how it adapts to a world that's messy and totally unpredictable. You know, we tend to think of our DNA as this rigid, static blueprint with exact measurements, but that's not really how it works. It's much more like a dynamic network of feedback loops. Your genes have information about when to build things and where to build them, and this process shapes an organism as it grows and responds to what's happening around it. Life is never perfect, right? There's always what scientists call environmental noise, little shifts in temperature, changes in what you're eating, or just random mistakes cells make. All of this can disrupt the plan. So how does this dynamic blueprint deal with the unexpected? Well, it turns out living things have two incredibly powerful and kind of complementary systems for making sure things stay on track. There's one for dealing with the minor bumps in the road, and another for when the entire road changes direction. The first system is called canalization, or you can just think of it as robustness. It's this amazing self-correcting mechanism. So, for example, even if there are small variations in the number of cells when a fruit fly is developing, its leg will almost always end up with the right number of segments, 5. The developmental path is just so deeply carved out that it filters out all that minor noise. But what if the change isn't minor? What if it's huge? Well, that's where the second system comes in, phenotypic plasticity. This is all about flexibility. For instance, there's a species of tropical goby fish that can actually grow different-sized fins depending on whether it grows up in fast-moving water or slow-moving water. This isn't an error. It's the fish choosing the best pre-planned body design for its specific environment. It's incredible. So here you have it, side by side. Life's two brilliant strategies. On one hand, you have robustness, which makes sure you get a consistent result even when there are small errors. On the other, you have flexibility, which allows for adaptation when the whole world changes. It's basically the ultimate survival toolkit. All right, so we've talked about optimization, and we've talked about this dynamic blueprint. Now it is time to bring it all together. Let's see how these two incredible concepts play out in the one place we started this whole journey, the human jaw. So dentists have this term centric relation, and what it refers to is the theoretical ideal position of the jaw. That single, perfect spot defined by our genetic blueprint right at birth. It's our starting point. But what's so amazing is that over a lifetime, this one single point transforms into something way more complex and, frankly, way more interesting. This timeline really shows the incredible journey. We start at birth with that one single ideal position from the blueprint. But then, well, life happens. In childhood, our jaw shifts and adapts to growth and new teeth. As adults, it enters this state of constant optimization, always adjusting to wear, to stress, even to dental work. And by old age, that single starting point has evolved into a totally unique, personal map of functional positions. It's the history of our life, written right into our own body. This is the journey from a static blueprint to dynamic optimization. So the big takeaway here is this. The so-called ideal position of your jaw isn't some fixed destination you're supposed to maintain. That initial blueprint, it's just the starting line. The rest of your life is this amazing journey of continuous, practical optimization. Which brings us to a really fascinating final thought. If our bodies are fundamentally designed not for perfection, but for good enough, constantly adapting and optimizing throughout our entire lives, what does that say about our idea of ideal health? Maybe health isn't some static state to be achieved. Maybe it's a dynamic process of adaptation. It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. All right, let's talk about something you've probably never thought about, but it's a quiet revolution happening right inside your dentist's office. You know, we're talking about a massive shift away from all that plaster and those physical molds into a world of pure digital precision, cloud storage, and yep, artificial intelligence. This is the story of Gnothology 1.0 moving to 2.0. So let's dive right in. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever really wondered what's going on behind the scenes at your dentist? You know, past those super clean, sterile rooms? Well, chances are there are closets, maybe even entire rooms, just filled to the brim with shelves, and on those shelves are thousands and thousands of old plaster models of teeth. And that right there is where our story really kicks off. Okay, so Section 1, Dentistry's plaster problem. Look, for decades, dentistry has been running on this very physical, very material-heavy process. And as it turns out, this old-school method has some pretty significant and honestly kind of messy drawbacks. And when you put the old way next to the new way, the difference is, well, it's stark. It's night and day, really. On one hand, you've got what we're calling Gnothology 1.0. That's all physical plaster models, super expensive materials, and just so much waste and clutter that you literally have to find a closet for. But on the other side, that's the future. We're talking clean digital files, super efficient software, and everything stored neatly in the cloud. It is the classic analog versus digital story playing out right in your dentist's chair. So let's really dig into the hidden costs here, because they add up. First off, you've got the expensive precision materials needed just to make the impression. Then every single one of those models creates a ton of plaster waste. And of course, all these models have to go somewhere, eating up precious, expensive physical space. But maybe the biggest problem of all? The data is totally static. It's just a snapshot in time. It's a physical object that's incredibly hard to track or compare as your dental health changes over the years. So what's the solution to this big plaster problem? Well, that brings us to our next section, the shift to Gnothology 2.0. We're talking about a whole new way of thinking, one that's built on data and, you guessed it, powerful algorithms. So what exactly is Gnothology 2.0? Well, to put it simply, it's all about swapping physical stuff for digital information. It's using computers to simulate everything a plaster model used to do, and honestly, a whole lot more. By using digital scans, patient data, and AI, it can design and help create dental work with incredible precision. Now, this whole new approach really boils down to two main things, two big technological pillars. The first is something called the virtual articulator. Just think of it like a perfect digital copy of your jaw, one that can simulate every little chew, grind, and movement, all inside a computer. And the second piece, and this is really the star of the show, is the AI-powered software. This is an intelligent system that can literally understand the shape of a tooth and then generate or repair it all on its own. All right, next up, training AI to rebuild teeth. Okay, but how in the world does that AI actually work? I mean, how do you teach a machine to understand something as complex and unique as the geometry of a human tooth? Well, it actually starts with a pretty clever and surprisingly simple experiment. So, yeah, how do you teach an AI to be a dentist? It's a great question. And the answer is, it's nothing like how we learn. There are no textbooks, no lectures. For an AI, it's all about data, recognizing patterns, and just tons and tons of practice on one very specific job. Okay, so here's step one. The whole process starts with a really clever task. The researchers basically took a 2D picture of a perfectly healthy tooth. And then they deliberately damaged the image, digitally of course. They created a puzzle for the AI, and the puzzle was simple. Fix this. Figure out how to fill in the missing piece. Then comes step two. The AI gets to work. Now, it's already been trained on thousands and thousands of images of whole teeth, so it knows what a healthy tooth is supposed to look like. It analyzes that broken picture and generates its best prediction for what the missing chunks should be, all based on the patterns it's learned. And step three. This is where the magic of machine learning really comes in. The AI's repair is then compared to the original perfect image, what we call the ground truth. By seeing the difference between its guess and the right answer, it learns from its mistakes. It does this over and over and over again, getting a tiny bit better each time, until its repairs are just unbelievably accurate. And that's the whole idea right there. The goal is to perform this same magic, but on 3D models. That simple 2D experiment is just the proof of concept. The real goal is to take this exact same learning process and apply it to the super complex 3-dimensional data you get from one of those modern mouth scanners. It's about making the jump from fixing a flat picture to building a perfect 3D crown. And here are those 4 steps laid out. It's the AI's curriculum. First, it masters a single tooth. Then, it learns that tooth's place in the neighborhood, the dental arch. After that, it figures out the relationship between the upper and lower jaws. And finally, the masterclass. It adds the dimension of movement. So let's break each one down. Now think about how a human does this. For a person to do this kind of work, they have to learn a mountain of really complex rules about how teeth are supposed to line up. We're talking about things like Bonwell's triangle, the Bulk-Will angle, the curve of Spee. I mean, these are all complicated geometric principles that humans developed over 100 years to guide them. But here's the absolute game changer. The AI? It doesn't need to be taught a single one of those rules. Nobody programs it with the curve of Spee. By just analyzing countless examples of healthy teeth, it figures out all the underlying patterns and principles completely on its own. In essence, it writes its own rulebook, and that rulebook is way more complex and nuanced than anything a human could ever write down. So where is all this headed? What does this mean for the future? That brings us to our final section, the future of automated dentistry. Because when this tech is fully rolled out, it's not just an improvement. It's going to fundamentally change how things get done in every single dental office. The future workflow looks something like this, and it is incredibly streamlined. Step 1, a quick scan of the patient's mouth. No more goopy impressions. Step 2, the AI takes that scan and almost instantly generates a perfect custom-fit design for whatever's needed, a crown, an inlay, you name it. And then step 3, and this is absolutely crucial, a human, the dentist or the technician, inspects the AI's design, makes any final adjustments, and gives the final okay. So you can see how the role of the human professional completely changes. They're no longer a manual modeler, a hands-on artisan painstakingly carving and shaping things. Instead, they become an expert inspector. All of their deep knowledge and experience is now used to oversee and approve the work of this incredibly powerful AI tool, making sure the final result is absolutely perfect for the patient. Which really leaves us with one final fascinating question to think about. Will your next crown be designed by a human or an algorithm? And as this technology keeps getting better and better, the answer is probably going to be both. It points to a future where human expertise and artificial intelligence work together, hand in hand, to create a standard of care that's faster, more precise, and more efficient for absolutely everyone.
Let's talk about digital dentistry. We all know teeth are these incredibly complex organic shapes. So how in the world do you capture that natural artistry inside a computer? Well, we're going to explore how some new tech is moving way beyond the old methods, giving dental artists tools that feel less like software and a lot more like a sculptor's clay.
So let's just pause on that question for a second. We are not talking about a simple box or a sphere here. A tooth has all these super subtle curves, these sharp edges, and completely unique surfaces. Getting that right? That's not just art, it's a science, and the digital tools have to be totally up to the task. Okay, so to really get where we're going, we first have to understand where we've been. Let's kick things off by looking at the standard approach that's used in most dental CAD software today, and, why it's starting to show its age.
Right. So the foundation of most digital dentistry is a file format called STL. You can think of it as a universal language for 3D models. But here's the thing, its entire vocabulary is based on just one simple shape, the triangle. It creates this kind of digital skin, or a mesh, made of countless tiny triangles all connected together to form an object. And this is where you hit the big trade-off. For flat surfaces, triangles are perfect. They're simple and super efficient. But a tooth isn't flat, right? To create a smooth, organic curve, you have to throw a massive number of tiny little triangles at it. The more detail you want, the more triangles you need. And that just means more data, slower performance, and a much heavier load on your computer. It's really kind of a brute force approach.
And here's where that becomes a huge problem in dentistry. The most critical parts of any restoration are the edges, the finish lines, the margins of an inlay. They have to be incredibly precise. With a mesh made of triangles, defining these sharp features accurately needs a crazy high density of points, which makes them really hard to create and even harder to edit later. Mastering these edges has been a major hurdle for a long time.
So, if triangles are the problem, what's the solution? Well, it involves thinking less like a computer and more like an artist. It's all about finding a way to model with that same intuitive feel you get from sculpting a piece of clay.
And it turns out the issue isn't just the fact that we're using triangles, but the chaotic structure they often create. To really see what I mean, let's compare two totally different ways to build the surface of a digital tooth.
So, on one hand, you have the typical machine-made mesh. This is what you often get when software just automatically converts your scan data into a surface. It's this complex, irregular web of polygons. I mean, look at it. There's no rhyme or reason to how the lines flow. Trying to make a precise, artistic change to this is like trying to smooth out one little wrinkle in a crumpled up piece of paper. It's almost impossible. But now, look at this. This is what we're calling the artist's grid. Instead of that chaotic web, we have this clean, organized grid of four-sided shapes, or quads. See how the lines flow so logically over the shape of the tooth? This structure isn't random. It's designed by a human for a human. It's literally built for editing.
And this clean structure totally changes the game. You can just select an intersection point on the grid and then push it, pull it, or move it. And because the grid is so well organized, the whole surface adapts smoothly and predictably, just like you're shaping clay. You're not fighting with the model anymore. You're actually sculpting it.
Now, this whole digital clay idea isn't just a cool concept. It's a reality in powerful platforms like SolidWorks. There are actually two main ways to get this kind of intuitive modeling, so let's take a quick look at both of them.
The first path is a tool called X-Shape. You can think of this as the next generation approach. It's designed from the ground up to add this intuitive, free-form workflow to the powerful SolidWorks environment.
So X-Shape is a modern browser-based tool that lives on the 3D Experience platform, which is great because it means you can access it from anywhere. It's built specifically for this kind of free-form, organic surface creation. What's really cool is its flexibility. You can design everything in the cloud and then seamlessly bring that sculpted tooth right into your traditional SolidWorks design on your desktop. It really delivers that hands-on, clay-like experience we've been talking about.
Now, the second path gives you that same level of control, but through a really powerful add-on software from Integrity Wear Inc. called Power Surfacing for SolidWorks. This takes a bit of a different approach by bringing that digital clay functionality right inside the desktop application you already know.
So this tool from Integrity Wear brings that digital clay workflow directly into the familiar SolidWorks environment. It uses this really clever process where your scan data gets converted into something called a subdivision surface, which is just the technical term for that clean, editable artist's grid. And, crucially, it saves your work in a way that preserves that beautiful grid, so you can always go back and fine-tune your design with that same intuitive control. Okay, so creating a beautifully sculpted crown is one thing, but the real power comes from what you can do with that model once it's made. Using a whole platform opens up a completely new world of possibilities that go way beyond the shape of just a single tooth. This is where things get really exciting. Within the same system, you can simulate actual jaw movement to test how your design functions in the real world. You can analyze how food will flow over the chewing surface. Feeling creative, you could literally design your own custom articulators or dental tools. And when it's absolutely perfect, you just send it directly to a 3D printer. It becomes this complete, end-to-end digital workflow.
And this brings up such a vital point, especially with all the talk about AI these days. You could have the smartest AI in the world generate a crown, but if the underlying structure it creates is a chaotic mess, it's basically useless for a professional who needs to make those final critical adjustments. The technology has to empower human artistry, not try to replace it.
Things to check when using AI to automatically generate tooth crown shapes. Automatic functional and structural division of tooth shapes using AI is something we hope for, but it is not yet a reality. Currently, subdivision surfaces only allow curvature connections when connecting surfaces. It would be good if positional continuity connections were available as an option for connection methods. This is a necessary feature for connecting the margin and axial surface of the tooth.
So we'll end with this thought. The goal of all this tech isn't just to replicate a tooth. It's to provide tools that are so intuitive and so powerful that they feel like an extension of the artist's own hands. It really makes you wonder, what new levels of beauty, function, and creativity are going to be possible as that boundary between the digital and the physical just continues to dissolve?
Okay, get ready for this one. Science, religion, and the Emperor of Japan. You're probably thinking, what in the world do those three things have in common? Well, what if I told you there's a wild, incredibly ambitious theory out there that tries to tie them all together? We're about to dive into a proposal that aims to solve a very modern problem by rethinking, well, pretty much the entire history of Japan.
So it all kicks off with this single number, less than 1%. That's how many people in Japan identify as Christian. And look, this is a question people have been asking for centuries. Why has Christianity never really taken off there? Well, a new proposal has an answer. And trust me, it's not what you're thinking.
The theory basically says the problem is structural. You see, for centuries, the emperor has been the top public figure for both Shinto and Buddhism. That gave them a solid, official place in Japanese culture. But Christianity, it never got that imperial stamp of approval. So it's always been kind of on the outside looking in.
All right, so that brings us to the proposal itself. And let me tell you, it is bold. We're talking about a plan to unify Japan's entire religious landscape.
So, what's the big idea? Here it is. The proposal suggests that the Emperor of Japan should become the official restorer of Christianity. Now, hold on, because this is a really key point. This isn't about getting rid of Shinto or Buddhism. Not at all. It's about adding Christianity into the mix, bringing it under the same umbrella of imperial authority to create this new, unified system.
So you might be asking why the emperor? Well, it all comes down to history. The title Tenno, which means emperor, actually comes from ancient Chinese cosmology. It's linked to the North Star. This role was cemented way back in the 7th century. And it's not just an internal view. Even Western observers centuries ago, like this guy Camphor in the 1600s, looked at the emperor and basically said, yeah, that's their pope. He saw him as the supreme head of both major religions. So this idea of the emperor as a religious unifier, it's been there for a long, long time. It's the whole foundation for this idea.
Okay, but history alone isn't going to cut it. For this to work, you'd need to tweak the theology itself. And this is where things get even more interesting, as we look at a whole new interpretation of self-salvation.
So the core of this new idea is this. The path of self-salvation is to walk with the risen Jesus Christ. Now, I know what you're thinking. Self-salvation in Christianity? That sounds like a contradiction, right? But the key to understanding it, according to this theory, is to look at the crucifixion in a totally new way.
You know the story. The crowd is shouting, "Save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from that cross." For them, self-salvation meant a magic trick, an escape. But this theory flips that completely on its head. It says the real act of self-salvation wasn't escaping at all. It was the exact opposite. It was willingly submitting to the formal system, to the law, to death, even while being completely innocent. That act of acceptance, that was the ultimate power move.
So, what happens after the crucifixion? The resurrection. And according to this theory, it changed everything for humanity. Two big things happened. One type of power was sealed off. Let's call it time subjectivity. This is the flashy, miracle stuff, like turning water into wine, literally bending time. That power was tied to Christ's physical body, so it's gone. But, and this is the crucial part, another power was unlocked for everyone. They call this spatial subjectivity. And you can think of it as a kind of universal license, a license to understand, to explore, and even to rebuild the physical universe, the space around us. So in this view, the resurrection becomes this huge theological green light for all of science and technology. Pretty wild, right?
Okay, so we've got this new theological idea, but that phrase self-salvation still feels like a logical knot. How can a self save itself? This is where the theory takes another huge leap, using systems theory to solve the paradox.
So let's break down the problem. How can a self save itself? I mean, it sounds like a logical paradox, doesn't it? If the self is just one thing, saying it saves itself is like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It just doesn't compute logically. But what if the self isn't just one thing? The answer, this theory says, comes from a cool concept in biology called autopoiesis. It literally means self-creation. Think about a single living cell. It's a little factory that's constantly making its own parts to keep itself going. It is, by its very nature, a self-sustaining or self-saving system. Suddenly, if you see the self not as a single object but as a dynamic system, the paradox just melts away. So if the self is a system, what are its parts? Well, the theory breaks it down into two selves. First, you've got the private self. That's your inner monologue, your internal world. It's what the slide calls contingency. Then you have the public self. This is who you are when you're interacting with other people, your social self. That's double contingency, because it depends on both you and them. So self-salvation isn't a single event. It's the constant, dynamic dance happening between your private and public selves.
And this is where the theory goes for broke. It claims this two-part pattern, this private/contingency versus public/double contingency, isn't just a psychology thing. It's a fundamental pattern of the universe. Just look at this chart. In theology, you have death, a private event, versus resurrection, a public one. In quantum physics, you have the particle, a private position, versus the wave, a public field of probability. Philosophy, systems theory, it's the same pattern over and over. This is literally an attempt to create a grand unified theory of, well, everything.
All right, now let's take this huge idea and apply it to one of the biggest questions out there, consciousness. How do we get from a physical brain to the science of the mind? The key concept here is something called emergence, and it's a beautiful idea. It's when you have a bunch of simple things interacting, and suddenly a complex new property just emerges. A single water molecule isn't wet, but a bunch of them together, that's wetness. A single neuron in your brain isn't conscious, but billions of them working together, consciousness emerges. The whole is truly greater than the sum of its parts. The go-to example for this is an ant colony. Think about it. It all starts from the bottom up. Each individual ant is just following a few very simple rules. Follow the pheromone trail, carry the food. But out of all those simple actions, something amazing emerges, a collective intelligence. The colony as a whole can solve complex problems, like finding the best path to a food source. And then, this is the really cool part, that new, higher-level intelligence creates a top-down effect. It actually starts directing what the individual ants do. Now, if we apply that same bottom-up, top-down model to the brain, we get two different levels of consciousness. First, there's what you could call primary consciousness. This is a basic awareness of the here and now, the remembered present. A lot of animals have this. But then, in humans, with our incredibly complex brains, something new emerges. Higher-order consciousness. This is the big one. It's the ability to be aware that you are aware. It's self-awareness, and it seems to require language and symbols to work.
Okay, we've gone through the theology, systems theory, and even the science of the mind. So now let's land the plane. How does all of this abstract stuff actually get applied? This is where science gets a blessing, especially in AI.
Let's circle back to that key idea from the beginning. Opened spatial subjectivity. Remember what that was? It's basically the theological green light, the divine permission slip that humanity got from the resurrection. It's the official authority that makes all our scientific exploration and technological creativity legitimate. It's the universe saying, go for it. You have my blessing to understand and even reshape the world. And a dental crown is a surprisingly perfect example of how this all comes together. So, step 1, an AI scans a real tooth. It gets the shape down perfectly. But the AI has no idea why the tooth is shaped that way. It doesn't know its purpose. That's step 2, where human reason steps in. We know a tooth is for chewing, for speaking. Then, step 3, that spatial subjectivity we talked about, gives us the theological authority to go ahead and remake this thing. And finally, step 4, the AI becomes our partner. With our understanding and that divine permission, it helps us design an artificial tooth that's even better than the original. It's a true partnership between us and our tech,
all under this theological framework.
So, what is the grand purpose of all this? At its heart, it's about building a bridge. It's a unifying theory, an attempt to reconcile ancient faith and modern reason.
There's this great quote, often linked to Galileo, that says, "Religion and science are not enemies, but different languages that tell the same thing." And that just nails the spirit of this theory. Science becomes the language for explaining how things work, but religion provides the legitimacy. It gives us the why. Why are we allowed to do this? Why does it matter? In this view, they're not fighting anymore. They're two sides of the same coin.
So where does that leave us? I mean, what do you do with a theory this big? Is this a revolutionary new way to look at the world, a brilliant synthesis for our time? Or is it a dangerous idea, blurring the lines between science, faith, and the authority of the state in a way that maybe we shouldn't? It's an incredibly ambitious project, and it leaves us with one heck of a question to think about.